Good evening, everybody, and my name is Eric Wishart. I'm the first Vice President of the FCC Hong Kong, and it's my great honor and privilege tonight to introduce Bob Woodward, a legendary figure in journalism who inspired a generation of young journalists in the early 70s, including me. He's an associate editor of the Washington Post and became very famous for his investigative work on the Watergate scandal with Carl Bernstein. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 1973 and then went on to win a second Pulitzer Prize in 2003 for his work on the coverage of the 9/11 attacks. He's written or co-authored 20 books, many of them bestsellers, starting with All the President's Men, and most recently wrote two books. Most recently about Donald Trump. The last one was called Rage, which we'll be discussing tonight. And Bob Schaefer of CBS News has called it, Bob Woodward, maybe the best reporter of all time. And I would say one of Bob Woodward's other great achievements was hiring the second best reporter of all time, who's our moderator tonight, Keith Richburg, who tells me, Keith is the president of the FCC, and Keith tells me that Bob, I think you hired Keith in 1980 to the Metro desk of the Washington Post. So I think you have a bit of shared history there. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you again for coming to this Zoom event. Perfect timing. We had a great discussion yesterday with Evan Osnos about Joe Biden. So we'll be very interested to hear your insights on Donald Trump. So Keith.
Great. Right. Thank you, Bob, for joining us. Apologies for the early hour there.
No, nice to be up. Thanks, Keith. Good to see you.
Good to see you again. And we're really honored to have you here. It's really inspiring. I've got some of my students actually who've joined in as well. So it'll be really inspiring for them. So thank you for joining us here. Let's jump right in if we can. I was reading Rage, and I was really struck by the fact that it came out in, I believe, September, if I'm not mistaken. But when I was reading it, you called Trump himself the dynamite behind the door, which was the phrase that he himself used, meaning an unexpected event that could explode. And you wrote, almost anything can happen in the Trump presidency. And it almost sounded like you could predict how it ended, with this siege at the Capitol. Did it end the way you thought it would end? Or talk about the ending.
Well, you never know about the specifics. What I've had the luxury of time of continuing to work for the Post and spend most of my time doing these books, and to look back and figure out what happened. As you know, in cable news, there's so much of what's going to happen, predict, and I've never met anyone who really is any good at predicting. They can guess, but we run by things too much. And I found in working on Rage, I was able, because of the first book, which Trump denounced, that was fear. But then people told him, well, it's all true. So when I started the second book, he agreed to talk. And literally, I did 9 hours and 42 minutes of interviews for him. And he would call me here at home in my office. So I had to run around with my Olympus tape recorder in my pocket. He would call on the weekends or at 10 o'clock at night, and I could reach him also. I had a number. And so it's, as you know, Keith, it's bizarre to have that kind of continuous interchange with the sitting president, but it allowed me to prepare my questions and try to think about what was going on. And he told me things that made a lot of news.
After all of that time, 9 hours and 42 minutes, 17 interviews. You probably know him better than any journalist knows him. I'm just kind of curious, after the election, when he was publicly denying that he lost, he was saying that he won. Do you think he believed that? Or do you think that he was like with COVID? Was he saying one thing publicly and then believing another thing privately. How do you read it?
Happily, I'm not a psychiatrist, and no one in journalism really is a psychiatrist. So I've found doing this for 50 years, the best thing to do is to describe behavior, what actually happened, and let other people dig into the why. Now, sometimes, people will talk about why, and you can do some analysis about it, but Trump is absolutely unique. At the end of the book, I conclude that he was the wrong man for the job, and that his handling of the virus was a calamity for the United States, a calamity. It took me 5 months to figure out really what happened. And there was a January 28th meeting in 2020 where he was warned by his national security advisor and the deputy that the virus is coming. It's going to be the biggest national security threat to his presidency. And he failed to warn the American public, which he could have done so easily. And in a sense, been a president who did what he once told me the job of the president is, to protect the people. And so he failed, but he failed in so many ways. But the history books are going to pin him with the responsibility on the virus, which is quite proper.
Yeah. Well, Bob, can I ask you a little bit about the virus here? Because, I mean, around the world, especially in this part of the world, other leaders have used the virus to kind of seize more powers to themselves. And governors in the U.S., like Cuomo, have, used the virus to take emergency powers. Trump could have used the virus to take emergency powers. He could have, used the Defense Production Act to demand the factories start making PPE. Some of this might have been challenged in court, but I mean, he wants to be a strong man. Why didn't he use the virus as an excuse to kind of accumulate more power to himself?
Well, this again is one of the mysteries, and it was in March last year. I asked him about, why do you keep denying that this is going to be a big deal, that it's here? And it was obvious that it wasn't going away. People knew the death toll, a number of cases, was astronomical. And he said, well, I always like to play it down because I don't want to panic people. And this is, you've hit on the fundamental miscalculation that Trump made. He thinks that in America, if you tell people the truth, they're going to panic. So you have to withhold the truth. Actually, as Franklin Roosevelt, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, for example, rose to the occasion in a very dramatic way, fireside chat, and said, look, we've been hit. It's a disaster. Our very existence is at stake. We're going to have to rally. And of course, he rallied the country. I think it's a shame that Trump did not have the understanding of history and what the presidency can do. And I don't think he would have had to claim extraordinary powers. I think all he had to do was tell the truth. A week after he got that briefing, he gave his very the State of the Union address to Congress, and 40 million people watched, and he mentioned the virus and brushed it off. And suppose he just said, I've been warned by experts. My deputy national security advisor worked in China for the Wall Street Journal for years and realized the Chinese lie. So all you have to do is take some mitigation measures personally. It's not going to really disrupt people's lives, wash your hands, maintain social distance, wear a mask. Now, that was a long time in coming, but we know, I mean, all you have to do is see Asia, people in Asia on television. They're wearing masks, not just now, but always. I mean, it's a routine, and Trump could have said, just don't gather in small rooms with large number of people for extended periods of time. And he would have saved, experts have told me, hundreds of thousands of lives.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you just mentioned it yourself. At the end of the book, you did something that, I've got all the Bob Woodward books on my shelf here, and you did something that you never normally do, which is you come to a real conclusion. You said he was unfit. I mean, was
Well, I just say he was the wrong man for the job.
The wrong man for the job.
The evidence was overwhelming. And I knew all of these people, particularly Republicans in Trump's party, who stuck with him, but privately knew the truth and knew that he was not doing the job. And they hid and they lied and they covered up for him. And I was not going to join the ranks of those who would hide. And you're right, it's a little bit different than some of the other books, but it was called for in this case. And no way could you just kind of say, well, that's all, folks. This is what happened. What happened is a calamity, and now we are 500,000 people in the United States dying from this virus. Who would have imagined? Who would have imagined January 28th of last year? He was told by his deputy national security advisor that experts and doctors in China and in Hong Kong there told him this is going to be not like the SARS epidemic, which was not that big a deal. It's going to be like the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic in the United States, which killed 675,000 people. Well, that's precisely the number we're heading toward.
And this could have been prevented had he just listened to his own national security advisors, correct?
Yes, and taken it. Now here, I mean, I don't want to get bureaucratic about it, but this was a top secret top secret presidential daily brief, and the doctors were not at that meeting. So you have the stove piping problem that occurred in 9/11. You have the CIA having certain information, the FBI, other information, and they don't share it. Now they're supposed to share it. But in this case, you had the intelligence track and you had the health medical track, and they did not meet except in Trump's head, because he was given all of the information. And so it's completely on his head. And it's, I don't want to overstate it, but it is a tragedy for the country and the world.
Yeah, the other great mystery, at least to me, is that he continued to praise Chinese President Xi Jinping while at the same time criticizing China and calling it the China virus. I never could square these things. I mean, why was he always so effusive in his praise of the president, but also then so critical of China and saying they let it out in the world, et cetera?
Well, see, that's a really important question to try to answer. Trump believes in these personal relations, and he had this, he was pals with Putin, Russia. If he can be pals, he thought, and to a certain extent, it worked. He exchanged these letters, which I have in the book, with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. And I remember interviewing Trump about this and said, well, why did you do this? All the diplomats are saying, oh, no, you're not supposed to have a summit with the head of state without a pre-programmed plan. And then I guess I shouldn't. Can I quote him directly, one of the F words, or do you want me to?
Sure, go right ahead.
And
No,
I
go
don't
right
want
ahead.
to, will the Chinese censors?
No, I think they use that word all the time.
They do, okay. So we're sitting in the Oval Office and I asked about this and Trump said, I gave him one fucking meeting. It took me 2 days. And there's truth to that. And he maintains that it stopped a war. Their personal relationship, that's in doubt and question. The relationship is not good now. And North Korea has dozens of nuclear weapons. And that's changed the whole strategic matrix for the United States, and a horrifying possibility. If you talk to the experts, and I report how Secretary of Defense Mattis, Trump's first defense secretary, literally had to go to the National Cathedral here in Washington to pray and reflect on what he would do if Kim Jong-un sent a nuclear missile to the United States. And and believe me, that problem has not been solved now. It's in Joe Biden's hands.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of Kim Jong-un, I mean, one of the funniest scenes to me in your book, in Rage, was when you're in the Oval Office. It's right before impeachment. You're trying to talk to Trump, and he's showing you photographs of him and Kim, and he gives you a big poster at one point to take home of him and Kim together. I mean, that's kind of mind-boggling.
Well, it was, and you sit there. I've done interviews with lots of presidents in the Oval Office, and you sit by the fireplace, and they sit in that chair, and you sit on the couch, and they talk and answer questions. Don't need props. In the case of Trump, it's at the Resolute desk. He had these photos of him with Kim Jong-un, which he maintained were absolutely unique and important. Literally, they're on the internet. And he also had in a binder the letters exchanged with Kim Jong-un. And then in the center, he had the formal appointments for all the federal judges. And he's there, and it's not just him and the answers he's giving. He's got the props. He's got photos, he's got letters, and he's got appointments of federal judges.
And the other thing I think in that same chapter, I mean, you wrote about how he kind of meanders from topic to topic all the time. I mean, you were talking to him once about William Barr and his comments, but he kept zigzagging and talking about social media, and I call Twitter social media. I mean, your notes must be a complete mess trying to follow this guy's train of thought, right?
Well, I found that in these interviews, and some point I'm going to put out the whole 9 hours and 42 minutes, and you will see. And of course, this is the core problem in any organization. You've got to have a strategy. You have to listen to other people. You have to develop a plan. You have to modify the plan. But for Trump, it's impulse driven. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's fire people. I mean, he would just fire people at will. And it was, it's strong country, the United States. Got a lot of people who have lots of information. Sometimes it's wrong, sometimes they reach the wrong conclusions, but you have to harvest that as president from the whole government. And his meetings are monologues. His meetings were, as you say, oh, let's see, I just have this. I was talking to somebody the other day who was actually going to his office right when he's president-elect at Trump Tower. And in the middle of a meeting with a key person, Trump is opening mail. He's opening letters. Imagine if in the middle of this, I got envelopes out and started tearing them open. I mean, it's an insult, and he insulted people. He insulted, in your region, South Korea. And he told me, he said, well, we have all, the 28,000 US troops there. And he said, we are allowing South Korea to exist. Now, you are a nation, a proud nation, a successful nation. South Korea is a economic miracle. And you have the president of the United States publicly saying, we allow you to exist.
Yeah, it's incredible. I was also struck by, you had people close to him. I mean, John Kelly, the chief of staff, called it crazy town. Jared Kushner said it's the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. I mean, these are people who were close to him saying how crazy it was. So was this kind of a secret in Washington that this was all kind of dysfunctional and nobody was talking about it?
Well, this is what the real advantage of doing a book is. You can find out who said these things and you can put a name to it. Often in the daily press coverage, these people will not talk on deep background or in a way that you can use the name of the people who is saying that. So I much prefer doing the long form, but I also think that your former colleagues at the Post and New York Times, Wall Street Journal, many of the networks did an excellent job covering Trump. But as we're going to look back on it, he stumped all of us to a certain extent. And we need to walk that awful, painful road of introspection. What more could have been done to explain who he was, particularly before the election?
Sure. Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And can I ask you, were you surprised by what happened after the election when he refused to admit defeat and then the January 6th incident at the Capitol? Did that surprise you, or did that seem like something that was a natural outgrowth of this craziness?
I mean, again, nothing he ever has done has surprised me, frankly. But you can't say, if you look back, as people have, and quite wisely, that he was saying for months, he's saying, if I lose, it's rigged. It's a dishonest election. So he was falling back on that position. So in a real sense, he foreshadowed it and warned us.
That's a good point. One of my favorite books was The Final Days, but Nixon curled up on the carpet crying and getting drunk. I mean, that seems like a peaceful exit compared to Trump's. How do you put this in perspective? I mean, we talk about Watergate as a constitutional crisis, which it was. Was the Trump era worse, or what? How would you compare these?
That's a fine question, but when you work on these things, you realize each presidency is different and unique and has characteristics that are unto themselves. And in the case of Nixon, he was a criminal president. His tape recordings showed, massive number of crimes, indifference to the law. The starting event of Watergate was an illegal break-in at the opposition party's headquarters, the Democratic Party's offices in the Watergate. And in the case of Trump, one of the things I've finally concluded is no one ever pinned a crime on him, because normally to have a crime, you have to have premeditation. Trump doesn't premeditate. That's not the way he works. He does not think in an orderly way. And so is this worse? It's different. Nixon didn't kill hundreds of thousands of people in a pandemic when he should have made, could have made efforts, but Nixon conclusively broke the law, and that was a different time, almost 50 years ago. The Republican Party leaped up and joined the Democrats in saying he really needs to be removed. If I can take, you mentioned The Final Days, the second book Carl Bernstein and I did on Nixon. And after Nixon resigned, we're working on the book, and Barry Goldwater, the conservative Republican, invited Carl and myself to his apartment here in Washington and told us he would read his daily diary that he dictated. And so we go there, and Goldwater gets out the whiskey, and then he gets out his diary, and he reads from August 7th, 1974. And the smoking gun tape had been released. It was clear that Nixon was going to be impeached, charged in the House of Representatives, and so would go on trial in the Senate. And their Republican leaders from the House and the Senate are there, and Goldwater. And the leaders say, we asked Barry to speak for us, to be our spokesman to Nixon. And Nixon has no aides there, no lawyer, nothing. And he said to Barry said, well, how many votes do I have in the Senate? Well, you need 34 to vote to acquit you to stay in office. And Goldwater says, Mr. President, I have counted the votes. I've talked to the Republicans, and you have 5 votes. And that's it. And one of them is not mine. And the next night, Nixon announced his resignation. He realized he'd lost the Republican Party, he'd lost Barry Goldwater, and to Nixon's credit, rather than hanging on, he left.
What happened to that Republican Party today? Why didn't Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and all the grandees of the Republican Party go to Trump and say, you lost, it's time to go?
Fascinating question. First of all, they would not have been able to get into the White House with that message. Trump did not want to hear that. Again, part of the failure to listen. One of the important functions of leadership, presidents have to be like reporters. They have to listen, and they have to be curious, and they have to ask people. Trump now would ask people, well, what do you think about this, and so forth. But there was never an organized plan to listen and understand. And of course, the Republican Party is very different. It's my analysis, Keith, that in 2016, the first time Trump ran, and then when he won, that the old order in the Republican Party had collapsed. The old order in the Democratic Party had collapsed. And I talked to Trump about that, and sitting in the Oval Office pointed to the grandfather clock that sits there. And I said, you seized history's clock. And he did. He came along and he appealed to people in a way that was, look, I'm going to listen to your grievances. Even though I'm wealthy and my whole history seems to contradict this, I am with the common man. And enough common men and women bought that, and he won.
Yeah. Fascinating. The other thing with Nixon is, after a few years in the wilderness, he kind of made a bit of a comeback. He became a bit of an elder statesman. People would trump to him for foreign policy advice. I mean, do you think Trump can do something like, what do you think Trump's future in the Republican Party?
First of all, on Nixon, bullshit on the comeback. I mean, he wrote books, he went around, but the tire iron around Nixon's neck are those tapes. And new tapes come out almost every season. They release new ones, and you listen to the menacing voice of Richard Nixon ordering cover-ups and crimes and break-ins, and that's history. That's how Nixon will be remembered. When he died, the first paragraph of his obituary said that he resigned because of the crimes of Watergate. And so there was no comeback. Again, Nixon painted the appearance of a comeback. And in American culture, this is a former president. People treated him with some respect, and that's fine. But that's not the history of his presidency. The history of his presidency is crime, abuse. Carl Bernstein and I eventually concluded I don't want to go too long here. There were 5 crimes, 5 phases of Watergate. First was an illegal war against the anti-Vietnam movement, breaking into people's apartments, wiretapping. Second was a war against the media. 17 reporters and White House aides were secretly wiretapped. Then the war was against the Democrats, breaking in, sabotage, following people. I mean, the list of crimes goes on and on. And the fourth war was a war against the system of justice, the cover-up, pay people for their silence. And the fifth war was the war against history, which you and lots of, he kind of won that war because there was a comeback. No, he didn't win that war. But just like we see in so much of Nixon's life, it was another checkers speech. It was an illusion.
Sure. And what do you think about Trump? Do you think he has a future?
74 million people voted for him. Think of that. It's not an incidental vote in this country because last November, it was clear what Trump had done, what had happened, and Biden beat him by 7 million votes. But if you get into the details of this, and it's done state by state, the votes, if you change 44,000 votes in the states of Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia, Trump would have won. 44,000 votes. I mean, that's nothing. And and the pollsters say that the issue was, and the Republican pollsters for Trump say the issue was the virus. It was the failure to deal with the virus, and people realize that was the collapse of leadership.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Trump's future, I had a question that came in from a member, Peter DeCrossel. This is one I've not heard before. They said, based on your knowledge, do you think Trump might run for Congress in 2022? Because if the Republicans win, then Trump can become speaker. They can impeach Biden and Harris, and then Trump becomes president again.
Wow, that's it sounds like a novel, doesn't it? I don't think that Trump, if you go through the history of this, he wanted the top job, and he'd never been in politics, never held a government position, and that's why, or that's one of the key reasons why people discounted him, said this can't possibly work. So to run for a lowly seat of Congress, I think he would find beneath him. But it's an interesting scenario now. And then he becomes speaker, and they impeach, declare war on Biden. So, I wouldn't eliminate any possibility.
It's like House of Cards.
Well, it shows how fragile our system is, and also how strong it is.
Yeah. Can I ask you one thing? One, I want to ask you if one legacy of Trump's may live on, and that's this kind of attack on the news as fake news. We hear it out here in Asia now. Every autocrat who wants to lock up a journalist always uses this phrase, fake news. So he's created this distrust against the so-called mainstream media. Do you think that's going to outlast Trump, or is there some way that we in the media can get that credibility, that trust back again?
Well, this is the big question in our business, and we have to face the fact that people don't trust the news media on the left, on the right, in the center, and reestablishing credibility is a giant task. And the internet, of course, with the speed and impatience, moves everything so fast, you can't kind of sort things out. It's very, very difficult. And Trump, you're quite right. One of his enduring legacies is going to be, fake news. And a lot of people buy it. Unfortunately, we make mistakes. If I can tell an old story from the 70s, Keith, Katharine Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post in the 70s and backed the Watergate reporting, she was, after Nixon resigned, and she sent Carl Bernstein and myself a personal letter, but it was on yellow legal pad, it's probably had more stationery than anybody in Washington. And she wrote, "Dear Carl and Bob, now Nixon has resigned and you wrote some of the stories. Don't start thinking too highly of yourselves. And let me give you some advice. And the advice is beware the demon pomposity." And that is enduring advice for not people just in our business, but people on Wall Street and people in politics, people in academia. There is a tone of pomposity. Cable news, or its support of Trump or condemnation of Trump. There's a presentation of this is the way it is. There is no other way to look at events. Well, the great tradition of Watergate is you have to the very first Watergate story after the Watergate burglary in the Washington Post. Carl and I contributed to it, but about 7 people worked on it. And there's a sentence in there saying these 5 burglars were arrested in the Democratic headquarters, and it is not known what their purpose was or who might have backed or sponsored this. And so often there is, you have to lay out, look, we don't know things.
No, absolutely. That's great advice from Mrs. Graham. I appreciate that. It also seems to me, Bob, that Trump has reinvigorated journalism in a way. I mean, I've seen so much good investigative reporting coming out of the Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, others on Trump's tax returns, on the Trump Organization. Has Trump been a good thing for investigative reporting in a way?
Well, there's a lot of material, of course, and the cable news networks maintain that in the Biden era, it's slow and dreary. That may be, but I don't think anyone kind of looked at this as a moment of national joy, having Trump as president.
Yeah, and talking about the reporting technique, because we do have some journalism students and young journalists in here. I mean, you, if I can say so, you do it the old-fashioned way, and the way you taught me to do it, which you go out and talk to people face to face. You go knocking on doors. You go around at night to find people when they're at home. And so much journalism now is people sending email questions, a list of email questions out, and then waiting for the answers to come back. I mean, is that? Tell me the advantage of doing it the old-fashioned way. Please tell the students the advantage.
The old-fashioned way is you take people as seriously as they take themselves. You want to really hear them out. You don't do a rushed 5-minute interview. I mean, I think sometimes a 1-hour interview is rushed, is not long enough, and you have to go back and back and nurture and figure out what happened. There are always mysteries. There are, when I talk to people who are academics at presidential libraries in the country, Reagan has a library, Ford has a library, Clinton has a library. And I always think it's important that they examine and in a kind of disciplined way, what are the key unanswered questions about President Clinton or President Reagan, and address their research that way. I think as a reporter writing books now, I'm doing a book with Bob Costa from the Washington Post. We're doing it on the end of Trump, the beginning of Biden. And we have the time, we can go back to people, kind of say, what are the key unanswered questions, and try to answer those.
And I noticed that you're not a big social media guy. You're not on Twitter a lot. I mean, do you think Twitter and this kind of instant need for news is detrimental to good journalism?
Well, look, it's there. I don't have time for it, frankly. And look, it's part of the First Amendment. I think it surprises me, quite frankly, that reporters who are working on stories will tweet something, kind of, a headline or some information of what they're working on. And I think people are deluded sometimes to thinking that, gee, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are looking at this. I think in the case when Trump had his Twitter account and 100 million or more followers, some people thought, well, that meant 100 million people were looking at each tweet, and that's not true. What happened is the news media covered his tweets and amplified them.
Mhm.
So, but it's here, and you can't, as we've discovered, you can resist technology, but only so long.
Sure. And a question from Eric Wishart, our host here. He said a lot of useful reporting in the Hong Kong protests here in 2019 came from just amateur and student journalists using their smartphones. And they said, you've written 20 books, and a lot of our journalist members believe they've got a book in them somehow. Can you give an advice to somebody who wants to make that transition from being a street reporter to being an author?
Well, find a subject that is important, what sometimes we call the tall pole in the tent. And if you have unique information, what happened in Watergate, Carl and I did these stories, and he said, we have to write a book. And okay, and we signed up for a book that was going to be about Nixon and all of his people. And then we realized the story was moving too fast. And one of the journalistic rules is write about what you know best. And it turned out that we knew best how we reported the story. And that's what All the President's Men is about, the reporting of the story. So look around and say, if you got something that no one else has, then charge into it, write a book. But writing a book about, I always like to focus on decision making, whether it's in the White House or the Supreme Court or the Pentagon or the State Department or the CIA, because those decisions they reverberate and often can be historically defining.
And we had we have a very big question coming in from a member named John Resnick, who's asking, he said, empires come and go. In the last year, we've seen the disastrous response to COVID, the recent debacle in Texas with the electricity, most crucially, the insurrection on January 6th. How do you view the future of America?
Well, it's a leadership question, and we, of course, now have the Biden presidency, and Bob Costa and I are working on that also, and the reporting is not done, and we're gonna see how it works out, and whether, I suspect we're not going to have indifference to the coronavirus. Biden has made it very clear it's at the top of his agenda. I think there's not going to be another insurrection at the Capitol. And I think some of the states like Texas are going to realize that they've got responsibility to deliver power to the people of Texas. And so, things can get better. Of course, the big unknown is what will surprise us. 9/11 was, maybe shouldn't have been, but was a surprise. The Iranian Revolution and takeover of the American embassy in 1979 was a surprise. Presidents get surprised, and often they get defined by how they handle it, surprise.
And one question from Al Reyes, a member here. He's asking, are you already planning a new book on Biden?
Yes, yeah. As I said, Costa and I are doing the book on the end of Trump and the beginning of Biden. How much Trump and how much Biden, we'll see from what we can find out.
Great. Okay. And the second part of that was, do you think Biden will run for a second term, or was he going in simply to be one-term president? What's your prediction?
See, I try to avoid predicting, and I don't think Biden could answer that question.
Yeah. And one more question, I think from Al Reyes, from Richard Ward. Says the voters who endorsed Trump in 2016 and 2020 show that they're not interested in truth or facts. How should we deal with that?
Well, we've got to, a lot of people are not, on both sides, are not interested in facts. And we've got to find a way to reestablish more credibility in the news media. And that is a big task. And people need to think very seriously about the future of news. How do people get news? How do, can you take what happens and package it in a way with video and audio and newsprint and put out something where people on the left and right, you talk to Trump supporters, and I do, and they'll say, well, all of these conspiracy theories are out there, but then there's what's in the Washington Post. And, I think they're truly baffled. Well, should I believe this? Should I believe that? And we've got to explain why you should believe that.
Yeah, and again, kind of a last question for me, because I know we have to wrap it up.
Sure.
I'm just kind of curious. Do you think the press did a good enough job of getting out and understanding those Trump voters and explaining to people why they were so angry and what was going on in America? That it seems to me that we kind of missed something.
Oh yeah, missed a lot, a great deal. And it's, it's something that's also got to be thought about and worked on. And of course, I'd like to interview all 74 million Trump voters. That's not practical, but we got to figure that out and got to listen. And a lot of them, there are lots of reasons why they voted for Trump, but I think a lot of them are genuinely baffled about what's true. I need to go in a couple of minutes, Keith.
Sure. Absolutely. Before we let you go, can I just ask, what you're reading now? What can you recommend?
Okay.
What's on your reading list?
Yes, here's what I'm reading now. Promises to Keep, Joe Biden's book that came out in 2007, just before his second run for the presidency, that was also unsuccessful like his first one in 1987 and 1988. It's extraordinary that this man ran so many times. But what's nice about a book written by somebody who is president or running for president, if you really slog through it, often there are lots of revealing parts, and you can learn a lot. And so, that's the world now of when you're working on something, your serious reading is about what you're working on. Not a lot of Jean Le Carré novels.
Well, I know you've got to go. You got another appointment. Thank you, Bob. It's been an honor to have you on. It's been a privilege.
Thank you. Good luck. Hope to visit Hong Kong soon. Can a reporter get permission to come, or are they going to start banning reporters?
Well, I think you could still come. We've got the COVID restrictions on now, but as soon as those restrictions are lifted, we got the vaccine going around now. So as soon as the entry restrictions are lifted, I think travel for reporters should be fine coming in. In fact, we look forward to having you coming in, and we hope you come by the Foreign Correspondents Club and visit us in person if you can get back to Asia.
Okay. Thanks, Keith. Good seeing you.
Good to see you, and I hope to see you in Washington next time. Take care, Bob.
Thank you.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.